Hey, welcome to our second session on Mourning to Dancing, on really dealing with the process of grief and loss. You know, it's based upon our little booklet that I've written called, again, Mourning to Dancing. And you can get that from booksbyvision.org, or if you're taking the course that we're offering, it's very, very low cost. You get the book with it, learn a whole lot of good stuff. But anyway, however you're receiving this information, we're trusting that this is going to be a blessing to you. And hey, if you want to learn more about us, what we're doing, it's vision.edu, booksbyvision.org, or you can find out about what I'm doing at drstandekoven.com. So we're going to begin to look briefly at some of the response that people have to a loss and to the grief that comes from loss. Because everybody, and I mean this absolutely, everybody deals with grief differently. There's no right or wrong way to grieve. The only wrong is if you don't grieve. If you don't go through a mourning process, you can get stuck. It can create longer-term depression and things of that nature, which obviously you'd want to avoid. I mean, a loss is bad enough, but then to having the continuous reminder of that loss because of psychological symptoms that someone might have, it just adds insult to injury. And so we want to just briefly look at some of the, again, response to grief. Number one, grief is directional. It's moving. I mean, it's going toward something. Now, the something is not apparent in the beginning. I mean, in the initial response to grief, I mean, many people will just experience a sense of shock. I can't believe that this or that thing has happened. And especially when one has lost a loved one, lost a job, circumstance or situation, and it was unexpected. It can be shocking. And the initial response is just to try and cover up and hold on or even deny that the thing has actually happened. But trust me, grief is directional. It's going to move. You're going to move it down the road somehow. And the direction, we hope, the positive direction that it will ultimately lead to is a sense of reconciliation and restoration, and ultimately healing and a place of, as it were, peace in terms of the loss. Easier said than done, but again, number one, it's directional. Number two, it is personal. I've been with people that their response to grief and mourning, they're loud, they cry, they shout. Others are almost absolutely quiet, reserved, virtually stoic, but they're still responding. And that response is personal. And that's why it's very important, if you're going to be helping someone, ministering to someone that's going through grief, they've suffered a loss, they don't really need your platitudes, and they certainly don't need scripture quoted at them. What they really need is usually a friend that will sit with them and allow them to express their grief, their loss, their mourning in their own inimitable style. We have to recognize that grief is personal. It's also slow. I mean, I wish it wasn't true. I wish you could say to someone, well, look, the normal grief process is going to be 5 to 6 weeks. At the end of that, you're going to be fine. It's just not the way it is. Because it is personal, it is also slow. And really, oftentimes, the grief and the mourning response that people have to a major loss in their life kind of looks more like the stock market, if you would. It's up and down and up and down and up and down. There's good days and bad days, and sometimes within the same day, there's going to be good and bad moments. Times when the thoughts and the feelings that the person is experiencing are just it's just so deep and so painful. And other times the reminiscing is sweet and wonderful, if you would. And so remember, though, that grief, loss, mourning, it's a slow process. And it's filled with mixed emotions. Those mixed emotions can seem somewhat problematic. I mean, it's not unusual, for example, at a funeral or a memorial service for someone to laugh. I mean, the laugh is often, it's a nervous laugh perhaps, but it's still, I mean, there's aspects of the mourning process where it's not all just weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, but it's time of mirth, there's times of thoughtfulness, there's different mixed emotions. Some of those can include, and these are somewhat the more problematic ones, are guilt and shame. Now, guilt, I mean, it can be anything from survivor's guilt. Why did they die and I didn't? Or why did they lose their job and I didn't? Whatever the circumstance is, and there can be a sense of guilt because it doesn't seem fair, it shouldn't have happened to them. Some of the guilt could be because of unresolved issues in the relationship. I mean, I've had many times where I've been counseling someone, and they will say, you know, my mom passed or my dad passed away, but we had an argument just before that, and we hadn't had time to reconcile, and so they experience this sense of real guilt and shame about that. And so that's not an unusual feeling. Some can feel hostile or angry. Including angry at God. You know, I found that God's shoulders, which is, of course, an anthropomorphism. He doesn't have shoulders, but if he had shoulders, they're pretty big. And he can handle someone being angry at God. You don't need to rebuke them or try and cast the devil out of them, because it's not the devil, it's their pain. They're experiencing incredible amounts of pain, and they really need, again, a listening ear, an open heart, a generous spirit to help them. And so, you know, grief and loss, I mean, it's normal, it's inevitable. You're going to experience the pain of grieving when you've had a major loss. And just, you know, there's lots of aspects that go with it, including, you know, memories that they have to deal with. And sometimes those memories are kind of borderline on obsessions. I mean, they will want to talk about the same thing, about their lost partner, about their child over and over and over again. That doesn't mean they have Alzheimer's and short-term memory issues. No, it's just they're trying to talk it through. And many times it takes them weeks, months, sometimes years of talking about, remembering things before they can really come to a place of really peace or acceptance about their loss. So there can be obsessions, there can be self-pity, there can be denial, there can be all of those things wrapped up because, again, grieving and mourning, it's personal, it's directional, it's slow, and it's mixed with all kinds of kind of strange feelings. And so we need to give people an opportunity to deal with their grief, their loss in their own special way. Now, you know, there are some folks that they just don't grieve well. I mentioned the scripture before. Jesus, now in context of sin, etc., but blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. But the question then is, what happens to those that never mourn? They never weep, wail, they never deal with the emotions, the pain, the memories, etc. What happens to them is they often get stuck in the process. And in many cases, we can liken the symptoms of someone with complicated grief as someone who's similar to having post-traumatic stress disorder. There's some very similar symptoms. And they can include the following. I'm just listing this for you because as you're listening to someone share their story, if they've been, if someone says, I'm just struggling. I just don't know what to do. I don't know how to live my life. My husband just passed away. Oh, I'm so sorry. When did this happen? 1964. I mean, that's a long time ago. I mean, I'm not saying that their grief is still not real, but they've obviously not resolved some things that probably needed to be resolved years and years ago. And so what you want to listen for is, do they suffer from certain symptoms that may be still related to unresolved grief. Now we're going to talk a little bit about how do you kind of unwrap them? How do you help someone to overcome grief and loss if they're stuck in the process a little bit later? But some of the symptoms that you might find include depression and anxiety. Now that can come from all kinds of different ways and circumstances and situations. And really when we're dealing with crisis-related issues in general, one of the best predictors of how well someone is going to manage a crisis, whatever it is how well they've managed other crises in the past. And so if you find someone that, they just don't manage the least problem amongst themselves, they're likely going to suffer quite a bit more anxiety, maybe depression because of a major loss. But even so, if it's been weeks or especially months after a major loss in someone's life, if they're still trapped in depression, they have a hard time, sleeping, or they sleep all the time, they can't eat, or they're eating all the time, they're struggling and to enjoy any aspect of life. They can't enjoy, as it were, the presence of God in worship if they're believers. These could be signs of a depression, and it could be also somewhat anxiety-related, fear of facing the world, fear of relationships in the future, all that kind of thing. So you want to be aware of that. Flashbacks are not unusual. Now, again, to remember one's loved one, to think about them, to have pictures and all, that is all very normal and really in many ways very, very healthy. But we're talking about flashbacks, especially to the night of the loss or how the loss occurred, especially if it was an accident or something of that nature. Those kinds of flashbacks after a season can be very problematic and could be indicative of a unresolved grief response or even PTSD. There's always going to be a certain amount of anxiety and depression during various times and seasons. For instance, I have more than one friend that it's kind of weird, but their spouse died on either Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. I'm not sure, why that, but anyway, it happens. And some, when they get close to Christmas time, they find themselves getting a bit melancholy. Well, again, that would be a very normal kind of response, especially in the first 3 years of an anniversary of a loss. Now, it doesn't always happen on the day. In fact, usually it doesn't. It can be upwards of 2 or 3 weeks before, 2 or 3 weeks after, and they're not always even aware of it. I don't know why I'm feeling so out of sorts or why I'm so depressed or whatever. And then they realize or they remember, or it could be around an anniversary or a birthday, etc. All of those things, you want to be aware of those, be especially sensitive to those things, especially if you're ministering to someone who has suffered a major loss. Often we'll see in unresolved grief response can be an avoidance of just embracing life. They're stuck and they don't want to engage any longer. It's not unusual, again, for a season for someone to say, I don't want to date, I'd hate to get married again because then I might have to face loss. Well, inevitably, we're all going to face loss one way or the other, or others are going to face when we go. That's reality. But to be so frightened that you avoid certain places, certain situations, certain relationships because of the painful reminder, especially if it's been several months or years after the event, again, that could be a picture that maybe there's some deeper issues. And, if that's not your expertise to deal with those deeper issues, that's where perhaps a good referral to a family therapist or a psychologist might be appropriate. And quite often you'll find that there's what we simply call cognitive processing dysfunctions, if you will, or distortions. They don't remember things clearly. They don't see things quite clearly because they see everything, if you will, through their loss. And one of the things to be aware of, again, as we recognize that grief is slow, the mourning process takes time, takes energy. There can be all kinds of mixed emotions with it. So we have to give people time. We have to be willing to listen and to help them to walk through really the process of being really, if you will, set free from the ramifications of a major loss in their life. So in our next session, we're going to talk more about the process, if you will, of grief and mourning, and how to move people more into the direction of healing and wholeness after a major loss.